Please be seated. Board of Inquiry into the Hazelwood mine fire is now in session. Dr. Lester, I remind you that you have made an affirmation.
Thank you. Thank you. If the board pleases. Dr. Lester, this morning you gave evidence about the concept of evacuation in two different contexts. The first, how different it is to a relocation advice, and the second in the context of carbon monoxide. Do you recall giving evidence along those lines?
Yes, I do.
Assuming for the moment, as was the fact, you were on the relevant time the Chief Health Officer and not Incident Controller, in the context of evacuation, is it correct that if you thought circumstances might even go near the concept, you advised the IC? Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
And no matter how strongly you may have expressed your views, ultimately the decision to order an evacuation was the decision of the Incident Controller?
That's correct.
And at the risk of stating the self-evident, the decision to make an evacuation order is one not made lightly because the process of evacuation carries with it an array of its own risks.
That's right. Yes.
Can you itemise a few of them for us?
Well, as soon as you take people, particularly vulnerable people, out of their known and trusted environment, you remove them from their regular healthcare facility. You may be putting them in quite substandard accommodation. If it's a very large-scale evacuation, they may have to be in quite substandard accommodation, perhaps with inadequate hygiene facilities, or the best that could be provided, of course, but not to the standard that people are used to in their own home. So that carries quite significant risks. So any advice that I might give, or any decision from an incident controller, would have to very carefully balance the risks of the evacuation against the risks of not evacuating, and make sure that that advice or decision was proportionate to the risks involved.
If your recommendation or even advice in respect of evacuation has a connection with carbon monoxide, I presume you consult and are bound by the terms of the protocol relating to carbon monoxide before you do anything in the nature of a recommendation about evacuation.
That's right. It's very important to have a structured protocol so that decisions can be based on sound evidence, and sound evidence that's been agreed on prior to that decision being made. So that's very important.
You were asked this morning about tab 5, page 22. Would you mind going to that, please? Do you have that in front of you?
I do.
What's the correct title for that document?
This is a high-level bushfire smoke advisory template.
Right. You were asked this morning about the things that it said, the things that it doesn't say, and that it was suggested to you that there are noticeable gaps in the things that it may not say. Do you recall being questioned along those lines?
Yes, I do.
In other evidence before this inquiry, we've heard that you gave an array of TV interviews, radio interviews, you addressed public meetings, and you personally replied to emails. You've just told us about that today. Yes. Insofar as the information you gave to the community is not recorded in the document that's presently in front of you, can you tell us how much broader you went in the information that you gave to the community?
Yes, well, you just mentioned the press conferences. So I did 21 face-to-face press conferences over the period of the fire. I did, on top of that, countless individual media interviews with radio, television, the local paper, the Latrobe Valley Express. As well as that, the dissemination of information occurred through the local community engagement channels that we've spoken about. So the Country Fire Authority engaged in mobile community buses. There were the community meetings that you spoke about. On the 21st of February, having listened to the concerns of the community, which were particularly expressed at that meeting on the 18th of February, the department opened the Community Health Assessment Centre, and that was here in Morwell. This was designed to provide basic health assessment and particularly health advice to residents of Morwell who were concerned about their health. We felt that this was an ideal way to be able to not only reassure people about their health or refer them on for appropriate further assessment if that was required, but to provide that one-on-one community engagement where members of the community could have their concerns addressed, and all of the information that we produced, all of the community information, was available to them through those means. There were other means of communication which have been detailed. Social media was used. All of this was coordinated through a whole of government coordination process. There were paid advertisements, full-page advertisements in the Latrobe Valley Express. There were paid radio advertisements. So all of those sorts of communication mechanisms were outlined were undertaken beginning from the 11th of February.
And ending when?
Ending when? Well, it was right through to after the relocation advice was lifted.
If you can distill the message that you most repeatedly gave, what was it in those forms that you've just told us about?
Smoke is bad for your health. Smoke has health effects, and avoid the smoke as much as possible. Stay out of the smoke. Ideally, take breaks away from the smoke.
You were reaching for a document and you wanted to go to one when you were giving your evidence about this point this morning. What document did you want to take us to?
I think you're referring to the document, the interim report on health effects from the... that was a distillation of the data we received from the various health services around Morwell, and that is attachment 16. So it's called Hazelwood Coal Mine Fire, February to March, Assessment of Short-Term Health Impacts in Morwell and the Latrobe Valley, Interim Report.
Well, what did you want to say about that which you were prevented from saying?
The point that I wanted to make about this document was that we took very seriously information that we were seeking from the community, from community health providers, about what exactly were we seeing in the community. When we're basing serious decisions, we're obviously assessing what we know the risks are, but we need to make sure we're aware of actually what's happening in the community. And you heard Professor Brooke yesterday explain the process that we went through to obtain data from general practice, from Nurse on Call, from Ambulance Victoria, the Latrobe Regional Hospital, and of course from our own Community Health Assessment Centre. So we were monitoring daily any evidence of severe health effects that we might be seeing that would obviously influence our decision making. The comforting thing about this is that we did not fortunately see any severe health effects in terms of increased presentations to hospital, increases in ambulance call-outs. The discussion yesterday on this was that this was a health service utilisation report and not a health impact report. Yes, the data in this is a health service utilisation report, but it's also the mechanism by which we assess what health impacts have occurred. If I could give you an example of, say, influenza, how we assess the health impacts of influenza in any particular influenza season, so any normal influenza season, we collect data through a sample of hospitals, so what we call sentinel hospitals. We collect data on positive laboratory tests for influenza, which are obviously at the severe end of people with more severe disease will have laboratory tests. And we collect data through a sample of general practitioners. So again, we call them sentinel general practitioners. So from that, we can compare year on year whether we're seeing severe effects from influenza, so is it a bad year, or are we seeing less severe effects? So although the data is collected at a health service delivery level, it is what we use to tell us about the health impacts. The other point which was discussed yesterday was, of course, this does not take account of those lower level, if I put it that way, very distressing symptoms which are due to the smoke irritation. So effects on eyes, nose, breathing, making things very uncomfortable. yes, of course, it does not take account of that, and we absolutely acknowledge that the community suffered some very distressing symptoms such as those. But as Chief Health Officer, I have to focus my energy on the serious effects. So just as influenza, there will be many people who contract influenza during the influenza season, feel pretty terrible for a week, but don't need to seek medical attention. That doesn't come to our attention. We need to concentrate serious decisions on the more serious end of the health spectrum. So that's what we did in this report. We were looking for serious health effects, and fortunately we didn't see those, but that's not to discount the level of very distressing symptoms that the community did experience.
Is that all we want to say on that issue?
Yes.
Thank you. Either in your witness statement or this morning, forgive me, I can't point to where you have told us that you're assessing events from the health perspective on a day-to-day basis on and from the 11th. Have I got your evidence right in that regard?
I'm not quite sure what you're asking.
You're watching the physical event unfold and making decisions based on the fire, its escalation or its recession on a day-to-day basis.
That's right.
Yes. You're a person of enormous professional qualification and veneration. In your opinion, is that a reasonable approach?
I think that's a very reasonable approach.
If you had been told on the first week that you had arrived on this scene that the fire would last for a month, that it would generate seriously hazardous fumes, over a period of 1 month, over 1,000 people would try in vain to extinguish that fire, what in that first week would your health message have been?
That smoke has effects on your health and you should minimise your exposure to the smoke as much as possible.
Sounds awfully like the message you gave.
Yes, I believe that's the message we gave.
Is it correct to say that each day, or at least regularly, the composition of the smoke altered in some respect or another?
Well, you've heard the evidence from the Environment Protection Authority about the data that they were able to provide. We're not able to distinguish, particularly in that first week. As we said, we didn't have specific data during that first week to know exactly what prominence the bushfires were having as opposed to the smoke from the coal mine. But nevertheless, the message is the same. So whether it's bushfire smoke or whether it's coal mine fire smoke, the message remains the same, that people should minimise their exposure if they can.
By the 28th, you saw that this community had endured for some time in these conditions, correct?
Correct.
Mr. Lapsley was projecting to you that the conditions would go on for some time.
That's correct.
You, by that stage, had a sophisticated understanding of the community which made up the inhabitants of Morwell and the surrounding area.
That's correct.
And even so, in the period between the time that you first became involved on the 8th and the 28th, there were times where wind changes abated the conditions periodically. Is that right?
That's right. The graph that we looked at in terms of PM 2.5 levels was a 24-hour average graph. So on that, you saw how the levels fluctuated quite dramatically. But what that does hide, of course, is that within a 24-hour time period, there were times when obviously the wind change was favourable and the air quality improved dramatically.
In that period between the 11th and the 28th, is it fair to say that the composition of the smoke changed?
The composition of the smoke, well, I'm not quite sure what you're referring to.
Pardon me, the composition or the ingredients of the smoke?
Well, the ingredients of the smoke that we know are particulate matter, PM2.5, PM10, carbon monoxide. So those sorts of things that we were measuring, those were what we knew about.
In the
Dr. Torre spoke about one or more occasions when he was conscious of the smoke being much more dense. I don't know whether that's what Dr. Wilson is getting to, but were you aware of the fact that there were occasions when the smoke was less dense and more dense, and that would have affected your assessment of the overall position?
Oh yes, certainly I'm aware that the smoke was much more dense at times, and that obviously correlates with those very high peaks of particulate matter that we saw. They would occur at the times when the smoke was very much more dense.
Was that, or does that tend to be on occasions when the wind was coming from the southwest?
That's right, yes.
Thank you.
So sorry, just to follow this line of thinking, you just commented on the 24-hour average reading when things could be very much lower and very much higher, and we heard from yesterday that potentially there were peaks of 1,300 in terms of short acting. The PM 2.5 protocol doesn't actually give any trigger points for shorter durations, whereas your bushfire protocol does for PM10, where there's a PM10 1-hour trigger point. Was that something you thought about including in the protocol?
Well, the bushfire smoke protocol is really there for short-term events. It's there for predictive purposes. So it's mainly used for prediction for issuing a media release clearly for the next day, or for that if we issue it in the morning for that evening. So that's more for predictive purposes. The PM 2.5 protocol was developed specifically for this situation because we were sort of out of the short term, this is what it's going to be tomorrow. We were out of that situation and we were into quite a unique situation. So that's why we developed the PM 2.5 protocol. But knowing the basis of what the risk is, really very high instantaneous peaks are not nearly as significant for our decision making as a 24-hour rolling average. So that's why we requested the 24-hour rolling average to assist our decision making around PM 2.5.
Just a quick follow-up, but for a vulnerable population group like people with asthma, wouldn't high levels of PM 2.5 be quite deleterious to their health, albeit only for a few hours?
The PM 2.5 protocol was designed with protection of the vulnerable groups in mind. So we believe, and as I said, we received peer review that was appropriate. We believe that was appropriately protecting those vulnerable groups.
Thank you, Professor. Realising that you had no power yourself to order an evacuation, and realising how the rolling averages in the lead up to 28 February were, as the statistics show, is it still your evidence that the relocation advice was appropriate in all the circumstances?
Yes, I do believe it was appropriate in the circumstances.
You were asked about the information you received from South Morwell earlier in the events with which we're concerned. Do you recall being questioned about that?
Yes, I do.
Did the fact that the information coming as it did from South Morwell cause you to question its reliability in that it came from a specific place in particular?
The information early on in the event, which I was questioned on this morning, this comes back to the reliability of the data and the format in which we were getting the data. And as I mentioned, the format or what we really required for decision making was more than just individual spot readings and readings where we didn't know the location or the actual validation of that reading. So what we needed for decision making against our protocol was a more substantial and validated set of data.
And again, possibly to state the obvious, but the further away from the mine, the less of the risk of caused by the particulates.
Yes, that's correct.
It was put to you, and I hope I'm not being unkind, that you had no meaningful information about what was happening in the community in or around the 13th. Do you recall questions along those lines?
Yes, I do.
Would you mind going to paragraph 52 of your witness statement? There you speak of events from 13 February 2014, and in particular the work being done by the CFA in conducting air quality monitoring for carbon monoxide in Morwell. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
No doubt you placed reliance upon that information.
That's right. And
And-
this was referred to this morning about the fact sheet for the 14th of February. So yes, that's the correct date.
Now, would you go to the document behind tab 7, please? And again, how do you describe this document that you've signed personally as approving it?
This was information that we wanted to put together to give the community in that first week of the fire.
What do you call this document?
We call it a community information sheet.
All right. Well, you were asked what a person might be told if the caller rang one of the 1300 numbers. Set on, you recall being questioned about that. One of the options on page 3 of that document is to ring nurses on call. Do you see that? And are we to understand the effect of this document to be that if a person had a specific health issue, rather than ringing a number that might provide untargeted generic information or provide generic untargeted advice, that document invited the caller to specifically ring nurses on call and convey the specific health problem that might have presented itself.
That's correct. Nurse on call is the on-call health advice which is conducted by an external company on behalf of the department. So it provides, as the name suggests, constant health advice for people who ring, and it's authoritative. Its content is known and trusted. So for people ringing Nurse on Call, every time we have an issue, all of our information is given to Nurse on Call so that they can authoritatively give the same information as the information we're giving in all our other material.
It was put to you that the carbon monoxide protocol was not signed until a date in March. Do you recall being questioned about that?
Yes, I do.
You answered by saying that it was being practically applied before that date.
That's right.
From what date was it being practically applied?
From the 16th of February.
You were asked about the Watch and Act, and as best I recall, you told us this morning that it sent a concerning message, or a message that you regarded as being concerning. Do you recall that?
Yes, I do.
Why do you tell us that it conveyed a concerning message?
At that stage, in our opinion, the levels of carbon monoxide in the community were not of concern. The fact that the incident controller sent out a message saying, watch and act, this is concerning, was conflicting, obviously, with the message that we were trying to convey, that in respect of carbon monoxide, we were not seeing levels of concern in the community. So we felt that that was not helpful for the public who were trying to understand what is quite a complex issue.
You told us this morning about the carbon monoxide protocol and that it was subjected to peer review. Have I understood you correctly when you said that New South Wales, in effect, described it as being overly cautious?
That was actually the PM 2.5 protocol.
At all events, pardon me, you did internal investigations about it and received advice in respect of it? Or have I got that confused with the carbon monoxide protocol?
The PM 2.5 protocol.
Yeah.
Obviously, our internal experts developed that in consultation with the EPA. Then we subsequently had that peer reviewed, as well as having it consulted with the other environmental health departments in the other states and territories.
So what advice were you getting from New South Wales on that?
The advice from New South Wales on that was the last step, which was recommending temporary relocation, they felt was overly cautious.
And notwithstanding, you proceeded with the giving of effect to this particular protocol?
That's right. I proceeded notwithstanding that advice.
You were asked about long-term studies just before lunch. May I invite you to speculate, and I know we don't like speculation in courts and boards, but assuming in the next 10 years you detect trends from reliable data that is connected to this incident, what will you do?
Obviously, we would hope that we don't detect any trends from this, but if we do, part of the purpose of this study is to ensure that we have appropriate health services and support to ensure that anyone who may be affected by this has those adequate health services and support.
Various community witnesses have told us about conflicting information that they've received about the smoke and its contents. Just accept that we've heard that evidence. Is it your view that the information that you were giving was conflicting?
No, my view is that the message we were giving from the start was that smoke is bad for your health, minimise your exposure to smoke if at all possible.
Well, naturally, you can't control all discussions in the community about the smoke, what it contains, how widespread it is and such like, but is it fair to say that you were striving to maintain a consistent, factually accurate message that you gave in such things as the fact sheet, media appearances on your website and on such other information that reached the community or was available to the community?
That's correct, yes.
Consistency of message and accuracy
Is extremely important.
along with a message that's capable of being understood by everyone.
That's correct, yes.
You were asked about the events that triggered the CO protocol in the context of an 8-hour reading this morning. Do you recall being questioned about that?
Yes, I do.
As best I've recorded, you said that the information in the 8-hour reading may have triggered a consideration of the protocol.
That's
is that right?
correct, yes.
And you received an email from Vicky Lynch, which has become Exhibit 47. Do you recall that?
That's correct.
May I just read a passage of it and invite your comment? Vicky writes to you, I understand there are some issues to resolve in relation to the averaging of 5-minute data to 1-hour averages. However, based on this information, I do not see any additional advice as required, that is tonight, for CO levels in smoke beyond the high smoke advisory and media release put out this morning. You read that, of course.
That's correct, yes.
No doubt you have enormous confidence in Vicky.
I do have enormous confidence in Vicky.
Do you understand that the information that was referred to a few lines up against the words AEGL2
Yes.
is a reference to acute exposure guide level?
Yes, guideline level.
Right, and that information is derived from the Guide for Emergency Services,
It's
the
derived...
protective action document.
Yes, it comes from the US EPA and is currently being used in the Protective Action Guide for Emergency Services.
You regarded that as an unimpeachable source of information on these matters?
Yes, a very authoritative source of information.
So the readings referred to, according to Vicky, or at least your distillation of the information, didn't reach the trigger levels that were referred to in the protocol. Is
That's
that right?
correct.
And that had the effect that the protocol was correctly applied, thereby meaning that no warning was necessary.
That's correct.
Thank you, if the board pleases. Thank you, Dr. Lester.
Dr. Lester, just a couple of questions in re-examination. Dr. Wilson took you to paragraph 52 of your statement where you refer to your knowledge that the CFA and the EPA were using handheld monitors. Although you don't state in that paragraph what you understood the readings to be.
No, that's right.
So for completeness, it was Dr. Torre's evidence, and this is in paragraph 23 of his statement, that EPA carbon monoxide monitoring rounds commenced on the 13th of February, including schools, childcare centres, aged care facilities, but no significant readings were obtained. on the 13th of February. Could it have been that information that you based the 14th of February community information sheet on?
Yes, because as we discussed this morning, there was a statement in the 14th, the community
Yes.
information sheet on the 14th. So yes, it would have been based on, as I've explained in paragraph 52, that information was based on the CFA handheld monitors.
Yes. So you say in paragraph 52 that you're aware that monitoring was taking place, but you don't disclose any awareness of the outcome of that monitoring in paragraph 52. But for completeness, to complete the picture, Dr. Torre told us in his second statement that
Yes.
the results did not reveal any significant readings on the 13th of February. So that,
I'm sure that's correct,
Yes.
if Dr. Torre.
but those were spot readings, were they not, on the 13th of February?
That's my understanding, yes.
And you were prepared to accept that as a reliable basis for advising the community that there was no cause for concern about carbon monoxide in that 14th of February community information sheet?
Well, that was based on the information that we had at the time.
Yes, which were spot readings at
Yes.
various points.
That's right.
It was not the best quality 8-hour average carbon monoxide data that you later had access to, was it?
No, it wasn't. But again, I should emphasise that carbon monoxide is most likely to be a concern in confined spaces and
Yes.
very close to the mine. We wouldn't have expected in the community setting that it be a concern. Of course, we wanted to ensure that, but carbon monoxide does dissipate very quickly in the community setting.
Yes, but you were prepared to provide quite definitive advice to the community based on spot readings taken on the 13th of February, were you not? That showed no readings of significance.
We said in our fact sheet that there were no readings of concern at that
Yes.
stage.
And yet when there were spot readings that were of concern on the 16th of February, that was not considered to be a reliable basis for action by you.
The spot readings that were considered on the 16th of February were considered very carefully by my staff in consultation with Dr. Torre from the EPA, and it was agreed that they did not meet the protocol for action.
All right. Now, just before we leave that episode on the 16th of February, the 8-hour reading that was provided from that morning, and just bear with me. Range between 25 to 45 parts per million, did it not? Now, in the carbon monoxide protocol that you were just discussing with Dr. Wilson, one of the points at which further action will be considered is if there is a reading of 27 parts per million over an 8-hour period.
That's correct.
And based on that
Yes.
data, that level was exceeded on the morning of the 16th of February, was it not?
These were spot readings. These were not hourly rolling definitive readings.
That's not what Dr. Torre says in his email. He gives an 8-hour average.
These were,
For
the
the Sunday
advice that
morning.
I had was that these were instantaneous readings over that 8-hour period.
You have
That's the
the
advice that I have.
You have the email there in front of you?
Yes.
And there's two parts to it, are there not? There's the morning 8-hour average.
During 030
00:30
and 8:30.
and
yes.
8:30. There's the morning 8-hour average,
Mhm.
and then there are a series of short-term readings for the afternoon.
Yes, that's what's here.
Yes, and accepting that Dr. Torre has provided an 8-hour average for the morning, that threshold of 27 parts per million over 8 hours was exceeded that morning, was it not?
Well, I'll take you back to the other part of the email where my staff member Vicky Lynch discussed
like
these
you
readings
to-
readings with Dr. Torre, and it was decided that there were difficulties in translating those readings to something which could be interpreted under the protocol.
Yes, and that is clearly a reference to the readings taken in the afternoon, is it not?
Yes.
Yes. Ms Lynch doesn't deal at all with the 8-hour average that was recorded for the morning, does she?
The discussion here relates to issues relating to generation of what we needed for the protocol from these types of readings.
And there is no discussion in Ms Lynch's email of the 8-hour average that was obtained for the morning. that
No.
exceeded the threshold that had been determined to be appropriate in the course of that afternoon?
There is no specific discussion, but those readings, my understanding is that those readings were on the same basis as the other readings. Therefore, they did not meet the criteria as discussed with the EPA for triggering the protocol.
I've no further questions. Do any members of the board have anything further?
You mentioned the Long Health study, and just to understand your response, Dr. Lester, I think you were saying that if during the course of the study information arose that could influence health service responses or other actions to help the community, you would take those steps, or that would initiate a response.
Absolutely.
Is that right? Yeah.
That's right, yes.
Would that also apply to individuals that you were actually examining and reviewing and following? If their health was deteriorating and the investigators were concerned, would that stimulate practical action to that individual?
Yes, absolutely. If the investigators found something which was concerning, which was not already being addressed adequately by their own health provider, we would certainly bring that to the attention of their health provider and or assist them to obtain any other referral or any other assistance that they might need to bring that health issue under control or to assist with that health issue.
So, in essence, as well as providing information, if you like, for the greater good, it could actually be a form of additional healthcare intervention for that individual.
That's right. That's certainly the intention.
Well, that's very commendable. This issue about confusion in the general public, I mean, can I just return to it just once more? I mean, I'm sure we're all very impressed with your own personal application. Giving 21 press conferences, all this media activity was just amazing. But for some reason, it wasn't really connecting sufficiently. I mean, would you accept that? I mean, you know, that's the wealth of the feedback we've been receiving. So despite all that effort, I mean, what wasn't working properly? Or, I mean, can you begin to unpick or explain the sort of difference between a huge amount of input, concern, effort by all sorts of people, but unfortunately the community, well, certainly the ones that we have been hearing from, felt they were left in the lurch a bit?
Yes, look, I accept that. I've also heard that feedback myself. That's something we do need to reflect upon, and we will certainly do a thorough review after this, and as I've said, the information from this inquiry will be very helpful to that. It's interesting because mass media and the utilisation of press conferences and other media interviews is a technique which Chief Health Officers, as you would know, have used for a long period of time. And, you know, I used obviously the same technique in the 2009 H1N1 influenza pandemic, and that seemed to be quite well received at the time. So in trying to reflect on what perhaps was different about this, I think that the technical information was perhaps slightly more technical than something like influenza, which is perhaps more easily understood. And I think getting the message consistently delivered at the local level, as well as me giving press conferences, is fine. But doing more at the local level to engage the local community champions, I think that's where we really need to focus our effort now.
Thank you very much.
If there's nothing further, may Dr. Lester be excused.
Thank you.
Just do that.
The next witness is an expert engaged by the inquiry, Professor Don Campbell. I call Professor Campbell.
Please state your full name. Please raise the Bible and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
to this Board of Inquiry
to this Board of Inquiry
will be the truth,
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Afternoon, Professor Campbell. For the record, can you please state your full name?
Donald Alexander Campbell.
Professor Campbell, you've been engaged by the inquiry and have provided the inquiry with an expert report on matters falling within your area of expertise. Is that right?
That is correct.
And the report that you've provided is dated the 28th of May 2014.
It is.
And I'll just get you to identify the document for us. It's a report of some 32 pages.
It is.
And then attached to that is a CV, impressive if I may say so, which is slightly longer than the report, 35 pages. Is that right?
Possibly.
Yes. I won't take you through that page by page, you'll be pleased to know. Dr Wilson's urging me to, but it seems unnecessary. Have you had an opportunity to read through the report before coming along and giving evidence today?
Yes, I have.
And are the contents of the report true and correct?
Yes, they are.
And the opinions in it, opinions that you honestly hold?
They are.
I'll tend to the report. The CV speaks for itself, of course, but perhaps if I can just identify the key parts of that. You currently hold the position of Professor of Medicine, Southern Clinical School, Monash University.
I do.
And you're also the Program Director of the General Medicine Program at Monash Health.
I am.
Your qualifications start with a basic medical degree from Monash University in 1978.
Yes.
And then you have several postgraduate qualifications which are listed in your CV, and you're also a Fellow of the Royal Australian College of Physicians, have been since 1985.
That's correct.
In particular, expertise, as you state on the front page of the report, is in the areas of respiratory, sleep and general physician.
Yes.
And you're a clinical epidemiologist.
Yes.
You were in court when Dr Lester gave a brief definition of epidemiology. Are you content to adopt that part of our evidence?
Yes, I am.
All right, we won't go over that again. You've also have a very extensive and impressive research background, and you've undertaken several asthma mortality studies, and in addition you were involved in a review of the lung health program of former SEC power industry workers here in the Latrobe Valley.
That's correct.
You're also a member of the board of the asthma. You're a board member of the Asthma Foundation Victoria and have been since 1997.
That's correct.
Now, in terms of your involvement in our inquiry, on this inquiry, it dates back several weeks, does it not? You have been providing information and advice to the board primarily through Professor Catford during that time.
Yes.
You have also been present in the hearing, certainly today. Have you also been present in the inquiry room before today?
I heard Professor Monk.
Yesterday afternoon. Yeah. And you've also taken part in some of the community consultations that the inquiry has engaged in, both with the general community and also with a group of general practitioners from the Latrobe Valley.
That is correct.
Yeah. And all of those various involvements, as well as drawing on your general expertise, is the basis for the views that you're able to share with us in this inquiry.
That is correct.
Thank you. If I can take you to...
I just mention something.
Certainly.
Would Dr Campbell just mention what his experience in Latrobe Valley is and the region?
Yes. Well, in 1979 I was privileged to be an intern at Warrigal Hospital, and prior to that I holidayed in South Gippsland as a child, so I've got some connection with the district. And in the conduct of the review of the lung function program, I gained a high degree of respect for the members of the community, and particularly for the Gippsland Asbestos-Related Diseases group and their spokesperson, Vicky Hamilton.
Who, of course, the inquiry has heard from this week. Now, if I can ask you some questions about your report. You've very helpfully included a plain language summary for us on page 1. If we could go to that, please, page 2 rather. You note, consistently with other evidence, including the evidence given by Dr. Lester today, that the fire at the Hazelwood coal mine has the potential for long and short-term adverse health effects, principally due to the release of known air pollutants, including carbon monoxide, ozone and particulate matter. We've heard a lot about carbon monoxide and particulate matter, but far less about ozone. Can you deal with it in your report, but are you able to indicate to us the significance of exposure to ozone from a fire such as that which occurred here in February and March?
Okay, well, ozone is produced by the action of UV light on the constituents of what might be of the smoke, frequently arising from photochemical smog, and the components within that smoke that react under the influence of UV light. And it's a highly reactive oxygen species. It's got a short half-life, and the nature of its reactivity, it's most frequently adsorbed by organic material, and included in that organic material, of course, is biological membranes, and it's inhaled, so it can affect the respiratory tract, and its principal short and long-term effects pertain to its capacity to promote an inflammatory response in the airways. It's difficult to tease out effects separate from the exposure to particulates.
Yes.
And the constituents of the ozone components can arise directly from the primary combustion and also from downstream action of sunlight on the constituents of the smoke, and it can be remote from the site, and the amount of ozone produced goes up as the temperature goes up in the ambient air.
You deal specifically with ozone exposure at page 9 of your report, section 4.2. As we go to that briefly, and if I could draw your attention to what you say at paragraph 24, that people with lung disease, children, older adults and people who are active outdoors may be particularly sensitive to ozone. If I could stop there, that's a very similar overlapping cohort with that you've identified as being susceptible to particulate exposure. Yes. Just in relation to those vulnerable groups, you were in the hearing room when Dr. Lester explained to the inquiry the medical basis for that extra vulnerability, for example, of children and the other groups are identified, people over the age of 65, people with cardiac conditions and respiratory conditions. Are you generally content with that explanation that was provided? Yes. There was an additional group that you've identified, which you'll recall was raised with Dr. Lester, and that is people of lower socioeconomic groups. Could you expand on that and the basis for that opinion?
Okay. Well, I guess it's based on epidemiological evidence that this is a group who suffer more chronic cardiorespiratory disease in general, and that you then superimpose the impact of this additional insult on that group, and their health outcomes are worse. So vulnerable communities, socioeconomically disadvantaged community members are at greater risk, and I have to say it has been a matter of conjecture on my part over the course of my professional career why that should be so. Is it because people do not have the opportunity to have good nutrition during childhood and earlier, that means that they're at greater risk, that their lung function development is not as good, that they're at increased risk, that they're at increased risk of environmental insults, that they're exposed to more environmental tobacco smoke? What is it? I can't say definitively why persons of low SES are at greater risk, all I can say is they are. And
I understand. Now, can I take you to page 7, section 4.1 of your report, where you talk about carbon monoxide exposure, and particularly paragraph 15, where you explain the medical basis for the danger of carbon monoxide. Can you perhaps expand on that for us, please? What is it about carbon monoxide molecules that and the impact they have on the body that is so significant?
okay, well, carbon monoxide has a greater affinity for haemoglobin than does oxygen. And therefore its effect is to displace oxygen. Most oxygen, the vast majority of oxygen that can be delivered to working tissues is delivered by virtue of the fact that it's bound to haemoglobin under conditions of high partial pressure of oxygen in the lung, carried in the blood and released to the working tissues under conditions of low partial pressure of oxygen. So it's just carried and released. And the affinity that haemoglobin has for carbon monoxide means that haemoglobin is not available to carry oxygen. So the person will look pink, but they aren't. They're not getting oxygen supply to vulnerable tissues. The vulnerable tissues are called the heart and the brain.
Right.
It is also binding in the myoglobin, which also has affinity, and fetal haemoglobin has an even higher affinity than adult haemoglobin, and therefore the unborn child is more vulnerable.
Yes. At paragraph 18, you identify the initial symptoms of acute carbon monoxide poisoning as including headache, nausea, malaise and fatigue. The inquiry has heard evidence of a report that was made of some children at an early learning centre. There was a reference to it earlier today. It was in fact the trigger for Dr Lester's advice to the Education Department about the relocation of certain schools and early learning centres. The report noted on the part of children hyperactivity, headaches, flushed faces and longer sleep times. Based on your experience, are those symptoms consistent with exposure to carbon monoxide?
But yes, I think that is consistent in the sense that hyperactivity is a certain sign of some sort of excitability. The long sleep time intrigues me, but
is that consistent with fatigue, perhaps? Is that
possibly it is?
Yeah. Yes. I can take you to particulates, which the inquiry has heard a good deal about. So heading 4.3, paragraph 42, and you there distinguish between coarse particles, PM10, and fine particles, PM2.5, and perhaps particularly at paragraph 46 and 47. Can I just ask you to expand, particularly from the point of view of the impact on lungs and the tissues in the lining of lungs, what the difference is between PM10 and PM2.5 and what the concerns are, particularly with PM2.5?
Okay. Well, PM10 particles are deposited. How do the lungs work? Well, there's a tube that starts with the trachea that divides and divides and divides and divides. It divides 22 times in an adult. The alveoli are at the end of that process, and the terminal bits of those conducting tissues, respiratory bronchioles and alveoli, are where gas exchange occurs. The air that moves down those tubes moves by mass action until you get to the very end, and then the gas exchange occurs not because of mass action but because of Brownian diffusion across the blood-brain, the alveolar capillary barrier. The alveolus is this little bubble, and there are 170 of them per cubic millimetre of lung tissue, and all up in an adult human there's something like 500 million of these little alveoli.
In each lung?
250 per lung.
Right.
So 250 million per lung,
Per
so
lung.
500 all up. And the PM10 particles deposit by impaction and sedimentation. they're non-respirable. The respirable particles are the PM2.5s. They're 2.5 microns across. Those terminal bronchioles are 200 microns across, and for reference, a red blood cell is 7 microns across. So the particle is 2.5, the PM2.5s are less than 2.5, a red cell is 7, and the airway that they're going down is 200 microns wide. So this is sort of incredibly fragile physiology. And these little particles, the PM2.5s, are comprised of carbon plus stuff.
Yes.
And the stuff includes transition elements and hydrocarbons that are adsorbed to the surface. So you've got this very strange vector arrangement whereby these little particles are bringing heavy metals and polycyclic hydrocarbons and stuff into contact with the biological membranes, and they're interacting with them. The body's got two ways of responding to this. Cancer formation, when you're bringing co-carcinogens down there, and that's the story about long-term lung cancer risk, and inflammation, and the body gets inflamed. The airways get inflamed, the stuff gets across into the vasculature, and it promotes inflammation inside the bloodstream, and that leads to accelerated cardiovascular disease. So in essence, we've got two mechanisms for disease as a consequence of exposure: one, carcinogenesis; two, inflammation. The sites of inflammation are in the airways and lung and the circulation, leading to cardiac disease and respiratory disease.
Can you just take...
Might just get you to slow down a little bit if you could, please, Professor Campbell.
I was getting excited.
Some of these words are unknown to me. Chances are they may be unknown to others in the room as well. So we just take it nice and slowly.
I was looking forward to your summary, Mr. Rosenthal.
Oh, that might be a little bit risky. But maybe if we could take it to another level. We've identified, in the material, and you've identified asthmatics and children with asthma as a particularly vulnerable group in relation to inhalation, particularly of PM2.5. Can you expand on the explanation you've just given to indicate why medically they're a particularly vulnerable group?
Go with children. Basically, when you're born, you might have 20 million of these alveoli, and when you're fully grown at about 18, you've got 250 per lung. So something happens in between. You grow more and more of the alveoli.
Yes.
And at critical exposure periods, if you get an insult to this system, then you'll have arrested development, some of which you can recover from, and your lungs will grow, but you miss out on the bit that you didn't get. And also, in periods of, the lungs are vulnerable to, the airways are vulnerable to these insults, so there is a risk that a person who has a predisposition to asthma will have their asthma made worse. If they've, and the question is, could exposure to this trigger the onset of asthma? And it's arguable that it can.
Yes.
So we've got these effects on the genesis, if you like, of a chronic respiratory condition in childhood, which tends to be asthma, and reactive airways. And in making the airways reactive, they're vulnerable to the impact of further insults, such as viral infections or other and bacterial infections, but predominantly viral and triggering off prolonged reactivity of the airway. So children, I think, are vulnerable to the risk of impaired lung growth and to the risk of asthma being made worse.
Now, there's been considerable evidence before the inquiry, particularly from the community witnesses, about health impacts during the course of the fire. We've heard evidence of a parent of a daughter who got a blood nose at one stage without having any previous history of blood noses. We've heard of people with sore throats, sore eyes and so on. And one can assume, although it's always dangerous to assume, that connection between those symptoms and the exposure to smoke. Can you comment on that?
If I'm asked to comment about a specific individual, I'm a bit reluctant because that's claiming, that's sort of saying that you've got telepathic powers, I suspect. But
yes.
Why do people get nosebleeds? Mostly people get nosebleeds because they pick their nose. And why do they pick their nose? Because their nose was irritated. Why was their nose irritated? Their nose was irritated because they were exposed to these noxious fumes that were irritating their nose and the mucous membranes in their throat and their major airways. So I'll speculate, but not wish to attribute it to that to the individual that you've spoken to me about.
Well, thank you. At paragraph 59 of your report, you make reference to PM10, and that is coarse PM, what you've referred to as coarse particulate matter. You refer there to a review in 2005 making the scientific community aware, again, of the potential health risks associated with coarse particles. Is what you're saying there, in essence, that we shouldn't neglect the effect of PM10?
Yeah, I think we can't write. It's not as though we're dropping PM10s and only focusing on PM2.5, and the one is a reasonable proxy for the other.
Yes. Towards the bottom of that page, you refer to the short-term exposure effects of PM2.5. You're probably in the inquiry room yesterday afternoon when Professor Brooks said they were extremely well recognised. Do you agree with that description of the state of scientific knowledge about the short-term exposure effects of PM2.5?
To those who were seeking out that information and were assiduously seeking it out, I will say yes, it was well known.
Yes.
Had it washed over the rest of the community as an area of major concern, I don't know. I think we're still... but in short, yes, I think the knowledgeable community that should be concerning itself with this knowledge would be well aware of the potential for harmful short-term effects and harmful effects arising from short-term exposures.
Yeah, we need to be careful, don't we, with the language. I think we tend to be a little bit loose. There's short-term exposure and long-term exposure. There's short-term effects and long-term effects.
Correct.
You can have long-term effects from short-term exposure, but the two are quite different. Now, what are you referring to when you talk about short-term exposure? I see you refer to 24-hour average over 2 days of monitoring. Is that the conventional understanding of short-term exposure?
I specifically sought out what I thought to be a reasonable definition, and that is my understanding from reading the literature.
Right. So we're not talking about weeks when we talk about short-term exposure, or when the literature refers to short-term exposure, it is that 48-hour exposure.
And the short-term effects are time-lagged by 1 or 2 days consequent upon that short-term exposure. So, if you're exposed today, you'd be looking for effects tomorrow or the day after.
Understand. You were in the hearing room, I think, when Professor Catford raised with Dr. Lester evidence that we've heard about some particularly, almost spectacularly high short-term readings during the course of the fire, one reading at 1,300 micrograms per cubic metre. And the question is, from your background and experience, taking, for example, an asthmatic child, would that be a particular cause for concern, even if it's only for a short period, 2 to 4 hours, or that sort of time frame?
I guess I'm going to put on my clinician's hat and attempt an answer to that, to say, well, look, we're dealing with a complex issue. We have an information deficit. We don't have the information that would give us a definitive answer, but we have to make a decision. And to not make a decision is to make a decision. They don't have a choice. We've got to make a decision.
Yes.
And it's either it is or it isn't. And if I'm the clinician responsible for the child's care, I would be concerned. It's a long-winded answer. The answer is yes. I would be concerned because I have to err on the side of being concerned because I don't have the data that would give me a definitive answer. It's conjecture based on knowledge of mechanisms and evidence about longer-term exposures.
So you default to a conservative, concerned approach?
Yes, I would.
Yeah. I'm not sure, but it seems to be a similar point you're making at paragraph 70 of the report, where you refer to one of the major findings to date in relation to shorter exposure times Am I understanding that's the same point you're making there? A very high
Yes.
short-term exposure is something that is identified in the literature.
It was trying to tease out the literature to see whether there was evidence, and I think I say basically in the following paragraph, repeated multi-day exposures may result in larger health effects than the effects of single days. And it's to do with whether or not, if you've got these short spikes, frankly, do the effects of area under the curve sum, or is there some sort of multiplicative interaction? How does the body treat that sort of exposure, short, sharp shocks at intervals close together? And I think we say here, the effects of long-term exposure are greater than those observed for short-term exposure, suggesting the effects are not just due to exacerbations, but maybe due to progression of underlying disease. You've got two possible mechanisms arising from the nature of those insults. One, that you've hit the system, and there's a direct insult and a response to that direct insult, but then repeated insults cause further progression of underlying disease. And that might be why there's a contribution to risk of progression of atherosclerotic disease, and a curious relationship with diabetes. The presence of diabetes makes the effect of the insults worse, but the insults will bring on the expression of diabetes, it seems.
Right.
That's curious.
That's type 2 diabetes
2,
in both situations. And is that, might be stretching knowledge here, but has that got something to do with insulin production or insulin absorption?
I think it's to do with the fact that you stress the system, and
Yes.
under conditions of stressing the system, you have resistance to insulin, and resistance to insulin is expressed as diabetes,
Yes.
raised blood sugars. And if they trigger the definition levels, then it's diabetes.
I want to ask you a little bit about volatile organic compounds, VOCs. You deal with these at 4.6, starting at paragraph 93 of your report. You say that based on your knowledge and reading of the literature, very little is known about the health effects of the release of so-called air toxic from coal mine fires. Is this... Are we now in the area of the nasties that can be attached to the particulate matter? And I see that you referred to volatile gases, including benzene, in paragraph 95, as being identified in some of the literature that you've examined. Is that something that you have any particular expertise in relation to, or are we getting to the edges of...
You're getting to the edges of my expertise. All I can tell you is the limited amount I know. There's really an area for a toxicologist.
Yes.
We know that benzene is a contributor to risk of cancers arising from the bone marrow, leukemias and aplastic anemia, and that there are concerns about neurological development in the unborn child. As to being able to quote chapter and verse about toxicology arising from acute exposures, I am not an expert in that field, and hopefully the longer-term health study might devote some attention to those sorts of questions.
Perhaps informing that consideration is the only evidence, I think I'm right, before the inquiry about measurement of benzene levels at any concern is in Mr Merritt's statement. I don't think we need to bring it up, but just for your information, Mr Merritt, who gave evidence as the former CEO of the Environment Protection Authority, told the inquiry that of the volatile organic compounds measured, he said there were 14 measured, only benzene exceeded the assessment criterion of 9 parts per billion, and he cites 2 of the 3 sampling locations where that occurred, and the readings seem to be in areas of southern Morwell at the Early Learning Centre and at the Morwell Bowling Club, both one reading of 9.2 parts per billion, another of 14 parts per billion, in fact a third of 9.7 parts per billion. They are, as you say, they're matters that ought to be part of the information before the long-term health study, something to look out for.
Yes. The fact that one of those centres is the Early Learning Centre
is of concern. The evidence is that it was closed at the time, so there weren't children there, which I'll probably all be very grateful for. Before leaving your report, can I just ask you a little bit about the long-term health study, which you deal with at heading 6, paragraph 103? You have some experience to draw on in relation both to long-term health studies that you've been involved in and one that was going to happen in the Latrobe Valley in the 1980s but never did. Is that right?
Well, I found a report from CSIRO publication in 1985 that alluded to the fact that a long-term health study was to be implemented in the Latrobe Valley and that, in 1985. But I'm unaware of any long-term health study other than the study of the lung function study of health outcomes for asbestos-exposed former power industry workers.
That was the one that you were involved in the early 2000s.
Correct.
Reviewing, yes. So the long-term health study is long overdue, in other words. Is that the case? And you advocated paragraph 105 that the study should be established with the intent to run for 20 years. Why 20 years?
Important studies of long-term health outcomes, there's the Busselton study, population-based study in Western Australia. There's a cohort study out of South Australia of respiratory events of early childhood study. There are international studies, and they are set up expressly to have an inception cohort and run for a long time, and to recruit into these studies waves of new recruits in the district so that you can see whether or not there have been changes for different cohorts as you go through. So they can be quite sophisticated in their design, and they can examine important questions. The ones I'm familiar with are to do predominantly with respiratory health outcomes, and they've answered important questions about asthma incidence, the development of new cases and the patterns of severity. There is a Victorian and was a Tasmanian asthma study that was conducted on every 8-year-old in South Australia, in Tasmania. The cohort had every 8-year-old and has followed them all the way through now for over 40 years. Yeah, 40 years. So it's important that we have a long-term time frame.
Yes. So you'd see 20 years as a minimum period, is it, or an optimum period?
I think so.
Which of those is it?
Sorry, I'd be aiming out a long way. That you would expect that it's set up with the idea that several generations of researchers, in partnership with the community, will be focusing on trying to improve health outcomes.
That was the next thing I was going to ask you about. What role, from your perspective, ought the community have in such a study?
My experience of dealing with the former power industry workers is that the community are very switched on and have a very good understanding of what are the important questions, and they need to be satisfied that those questions have been addressed and that it hasn't been captured by the researchers for their own purpose. So I'll speak against me as a researcher and say that the researchers should be in service of the community and focus on outcomes.
Yes. Now, if I could change the pace a little bit and ask you about the question of messaging, particularly the health messages that came out during the course of the fire in February and March, and you've sat through the evidence of Dr. Lester, where there's been a detailed examination of the messaging. Perhaps if I could ask for one of those messages to be brought up. It's 18.4 of Dr. Lester's statement, and it was a message, if my notes are correct, that was released on the 17th of February. So this is a message that was released after what's been described by a number of witnesses as being a particularly bad weekend of smoke exposure in the Morwell area, and you've heard the evidence about the carbon monoxide readings on both the 15th and 16th of February, and the readings of PM2.5, which were up to approximately 250 in the Morwell South area. Do you have any observations about this message, and I'll ask you specifically from the point of view of a local GP who is identified as one of the recipient groups on the message.
Okay. I think there's an issue around whether communication is information as transmitted or information as received. And if we took the perspective of the user of the information, the user needs to receive information that can be readily turned into actionable messages. So that they've got to receive the information in the form of, okay, here is the problem, here's what you do.
Yes.
And it's very much got to focus on that. And if I can again speak and say, well, if I'm the doctor sitting there and I'm confronted with that individual patient,
yes,
I need to know what to do for that individual patient. And I need to be able to have a message that says, oh, for a young would-be expectant mum, this is the problem, this is the message. For a child at school, this is the message. For a outdoor worker, this is the message. For a vulnerable member of the community who's got chronic cardiorespiratory disease or asthma, here is the message. And it's really got to be actionable at sort of 3 levels. Anything more sophisticated than traffic lights, colour-coded, 3 levels, is going to get lost. And I'll speak from my perspective as the receiver of messages. If you make it more sophisticated than that for me, I will struggle to absorb the information and turn it into an actionable message. So, I read cartoons. I like cartoons. I can read dense information which is scientifically sound, but if I'm in the heat of battle and I'm under pressure, that we're tense, we've got the fire, we've got smoke, I've got anxious, worried people, give me a message I can turn into action steps that help me reassure my patient, and the information has to be information I can share with the patient.
yes.
And cartoon format, colour-coded, traffic lights, green, orange, red, be alert, be alarmed, be afraid. Really simple, actionable messages, and I think that there are fields of endeavour devoted to this, particularly linking it to social media,
yes,
that can turn it into very simple stuff.
Okay. Go back to the consulting room of the GP, and a parent's come in with an asthmatic child, and they want to know, should we be staying in Morwell for the time being, or should we go somewhere else? Should we explore alternatives? Looking at that message and read through it, are you getting the information you need to answer that question from this message?
Well, I think the real issue is I've got to work to find it.
Yes.
And if I've got to work to find it, then that's a step that arguably could have been done for me.
Yes.
And it's a learning. I don't want to be critical. In the same situation, I might have done exactly the same thing.
Yes. But
upon reflection, what do I want? I want to be able to sit there and get an actionable message that makes me look that I don't know what I'm doing, and that I'm informed by the best available evidence, so that we've got a partnership with the patient, and it helps them make a decision. The advice has to err on the side of conservatism.
Yes. And in that regard, you heard the evidence about the relocation advice, if I can call it that, on the 28th of February, which identified specific groups. The evidence before the inquiry is that that there were previous periods during the course of the fire, starting on the 9th and 10th of February, and then again on the 15th and 16th, and on the 21st and 22nd, where there were very high levels of either recorded PM2.5 or experienced, and in relation to the first weekend where we don't have the data. Can you think of any reason why the relocation advice should not have been given earlier? I want to explore that with you.
My glasses work very, very well in hindsight.
Ours all do, yes.
So with the benefit of the hindsight, I guess the question is, if I could take it through how I've thought my way through what's going on. This started as a bushfire, but very quickly became a hazardous materials fire in an industrial setting.
Yes.
That was of prolonged duration and of intermittent high intensity,
Yes.
and the literature that you go to find out what to do doesn't exist. There is no literature to tell you about this phenomenon, and these exposures are coming in peaks, and all of the monitoring systems have been set up to tell you about ambient air pollution in a big city.
Yes.
So we've got information about ambient pollution levels in a big city, not about a point source, and not about one where there's such local variability related to the influence of plumes and wind directions and a whole bunch of confusing but very, very important factors. And then I'm confronted with one person who's saying, well, what do I do? And you say, as the clinician, I wish to err on the side of conservatism. I don't have the luxury of coming back and having committed what I call a type 2 error, where I didn't do something where I wished I had. You know, I can do things and wish I hadn't afterwards, or I can not do things and wish I had done something afterwards. They're the two types of mistakes we make, and we make them all the time. So what's my default setting? It's conservatism. It's to say, look, we've had 2 peaks. You're vulnerable. You're at risk of morbidity, hospital utilisation. We don't have the luxury of coming back afterwards. If you are the person, the extra person who dies, maybe you step outside, you relocate, find your sister in Melbourne, or go down to Seaspray. Get out of here. So that's a long-winded answer to your question.
Yes. Oh, I think understood. Just going back to those local GPs and local nurses, and I think pharmacists was another group that was referred to by Professor Catford. What is the potential role of such? I think there's a reference to local community health champions. What's the role of such people in the context of a crisis, a health crisis like this one?
People look to their doctors to advocate on their behalf. There's an important advocacy role for the doctor dealing with... people have a GP, they trust their GP, they expect them to speak up on their behalf. So I think, and the same with their chemist, they arguably trust... they have a high degree of trust for the nurse, the chemist and the doctor, and they expect them to understand the issue and to have a consistent view and to imbue them with confidence that the healthcare system will look after them and that the advice they get will be correct for them.
Yes.
So I think that's the answer to the question.
So playing that key role, obviously, in an ideal world, they get the right source of information about a specialised and unusual event to inform the provision of advice that they have to their patients. Now, the next matter I'd like to ask you about concerns the carbon monoxide protocols and protocol, and particularly the peer reviews that were conducted. That material has been provided to you by the inquiry, has it not?
Yes, it has.
Perhaps if the 2 particular epidemiological reviews that I'd like to consider. The first is, I think it's behind tab 82 of Mr. Merritt's statement.
Okay. I haven't seen this one.
You haven't seen that one? If you go to tab 83...
Yes, I've seen this.
You've seen that one, all right. Audible sigh of relief, the bar table. This is the review that was conducted by Dr. Faye Johnson from the Menzies Research Institute at the University of Tasmania. Do you know Dr. Johnson? No, all right. He's having a little bit of trouble.
You sure? I thought this was Anderson.
They're both there. The first... You've got Anderson in front of you there. I'll ask you about that one. I can ask you to look to the second page of that, please. Yeah, sure, sorry. It ends in DPA 0001 007 0001. That's it. If we could just scroll down that page, we'll just make sure that this is this is the Anderson one. If we can go to page 2, please. Towards the bottom of page 2, there's a heading, Rationale for Choice of Health Protection Thresholds. Dr. Lester earlier gave evidence about the use of the AEGL2 guidelines, and that is the acute exposure guideline level 2. Is that right?
Yes.
Yes. The review notes that that's the basis of the thresholds, and just so that we're clear, the thresholds, the lowest of the thresholds at which would trigger action under the protocol was 27 parts per million for carbon monoxide exposure.
Yes, so that's over an 8-hour period.
Over an 8-hour period, that's right. And if we can, if I correctly summarise what this review is saying, it's calling into question whether in the context of this particular fire and the sort of exposure that was occurring potentially in this fire, whether the AEGL2 values are the correct basis.
Yes, I guess the reference here is to the standard being the level which, if exceeded, would induce angina in susceptible individuals. So that your safety level pertains to stressing my heart muscle that's in jeopardy.
Yes.
I guess I would probably agree with the reviewer that we might like a lower level than that threshold for that at-risk segment of the community.
Yes. So as I understand it, what the review is saying, and the other review by Dr. Johnson is essentially consistent with this. It's calling into question whether a 4% carboxyhemoglobin level is the right threshold, particularly having regard to the World Health Organisation 2010 publication, which is the one that's referenced in both the peer reviews as being a more appropriate guide, which, as it turns out, is considerably more conservative in where it sets the limit. Am I understanding that correctly?
You are.
Okay. And that's an approach which I think you've already told us you would endorse, that an approach that is set at a no effects carboxyhemoglobin level of 2% rather than 4% is a more appropriate level to incorporate.
And I guess part of my concern is because the evidence seems to be that you've got differential exposure in the community, you've got the potential for change. Carbon monoxide's colourless, odourless, tasteless, and these ambient air monitors may not give you the information that you need to make decisions about an individual at risk who is exposed and the 8-hour averaging periods. And I guess you're concerned about what might happen in terms of exposure that may exceed that to a greater degree arising from the plume that's generated off a coal-face fire. We've got a fire that's producing carbon monoxide. It's going to roll over the community and deposit. There will be areas where it's the potential for concentration, whether in poorly ventilated regions or not. There's a whole bunch of unknowns.
Yes.
So arguably, given the vulnerability of certain members of the community and the margin that you arguably need, what is an appropriate standard? And I'm taking the perspective of a clinician, not the epidemiologist. I'm just saying, well, look, I want a margin of protection for the vulnerable, which is not set at the point at which they develop cardiac symptoms by virtue of their exposure.
You want it to be somewhere short of that?
A bit short of that.
Yes, yeah. The net effect, as I read the peer review documents, of using a 2% level as your threshold rather than a 4% level, is that when that converts into a parts per million exposure standard, it drops from 27 to 9. That then becomes the trigger point. And I'm not asking you to do that calculation. I'm just trying to get you to agree with me that that's what the peer reviews are saying.
That is my understanding of what the peer reviews are saying.
All right. So instead of, as was proposed in the carbon monoxide protocol, you don't need to the public health officials don't need to take any action or give any warnings until there's a 27 parts per million reading across an 8-hour period. What the peer reviews are saying is no, 9 parts per million should be the trigger for action, consistently with what's known about carbon monoxide exposure.
We have a situation where we have to make a decision. It's the same scenario as last time. We have imperfect information conditions. We don't know what exposures are going to be generated in isolated pockets by virtue of this plume and the prevailing wind conditions. There are going to be people who are differentially exposed to a greater degree than others, and we've got people who are differentially at risk. What's the appropriate standard?
Yes.
Should it be up here, symptomatic from their underlying disease, or should it be a little lower?
Yes. Thank you. They're the questions that I have for Professor Campbell. Members of the board have any questions?
Thank you. I just wanted to ask your view about this issue we had been discussing earlier about who is responsible for the health of the Latrobe Valley. And if you have any views, I think you've talked about the advocacy role of the individual clinician for their patient, and potentially other health professionals can take on that role at the individual level. But again, particularly remembering your long-time association with this valley and the chronic health problems that have been, and now, of course, this further insult to their health and well-being. Do you think we have an adequate safety valve for expressing the health of the population?
Look, if we cast the net as broadly as might be necessary, this is a vulnerable community in general. It's suffered a number of toxic insults, if you like. It's had its workforce vastly reduced, and that's as a consequence of the change in work practice. The mine going from there's a whole history about the fate of the mine as a major employer. There's the impact on rural Australia of the loss of the middle class who were the bank managers, the business people in the community. There's a whole bunch of reasons why. And you've got a community that's of lower socioeconomic status. So they are at risk of poor health outcomes by virtue of all of the above. And then you've had the bitter memories of the consequences of exposure to asbestos,
yes,
which has left a very big emotional scar on the community. These are very raw and real wounds. To be able to produce a map that shows you with an X on the house of persons in whole streets where you've got X's that say, oh, this one died of lung cancer, this one died of mesothelioma. That's a very powerful message. People are holding on to that memory. And then there's this insult. We do not know the health consequences of this insult. So I think it's very important to cast the net widely, include measures of personal and community resilience, and to say, well, look, this is a community that's at risk. What harm could possibly come from having an advocate for the health of this district that marks it out as a community of special need? Because I think it is.
Yeah. If there are no further questions from members of the board, and I understand no one else has any questions, no, could Professor Campbell be excused, please?
Yes, thank you, Professor Campbell.
Very much. Thank you.
Ms Richards will take the final witness, the community witness for today.
The last witness for today is Annette Wheatland, who is a community witness. Ms Wheatland, could you please come forward?
Please state your full name.
Annette Wheatland.
Please repeat after me. I do solemnly and sincerely
I do solemnly and sincerely
declare and affirm that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
to this Board of Inquiry
to this Board of Inquiry
will be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Good afternoon, Ms Wheatland. Thank you for coming this afternoon. Could you please state your full name and your work address?
Annette Wheatland.
And you are the Gippsland Regional Manager of Southern Cross Care, or Southern Cross Community Care, that has its Gippsland base here in Morwell.
That's correct.
You've made a statement to the inquiry.
Yes.
It's a statement with 40 paragraphs and attaches as an attachment the submission that you had earlier made to the inquiry.
Yes.
You have a copy of it there in front of you. Have you reread it recently?
Yes.
Are there any corrections you would like to make?
Not at this point, no.
Is it true and correct?
It is true and correct.
Thank you. I tendered that.
Exhibit 49.
Ms Wheatland, you live in Traralgon, work here in Morwell, in Princes Drive, just on the other side of the railway line from where we are now.
Yes.
And you work managing Southern Cross Care
Yes.
in the Gippsland region. Can you tell us about that organisation, what it is and who its clients are?
Southern Cross Care is a private not-for-profit charitable organisation predominantly funded by federal or Commonwealth funding. It's an aged care organisation. Southern Cross is across. We work across Victoria. We have offices in metropolitan Melbourne and in other regional areas in Victoria. There is a bit of an affiliation with Southern Cross Care Australia. Southern Cross, as an organisation in Victoria, we provide services to about 1,400 clients across Victoria, which includes residential and community care, and over 1,300 staff are employed by Southern Cross Victoria. Here in Gippsland, we've been in this area since 2001. I've been in this role since then, starting up the branch here in Morwell. In Gippsland, we provide services to well over 300 clients across Gippsland, and we employ over 45 staff across Gippsland.
And Gippsland's a fairly large region.
Fairly large.
What are the boundaries of the area you're responsible for?
Gippsland?
So from Can River through to Warragul?
Pretty much, yes.
And
Drill.
down to Leongatha,
Yep.
Wonthaggi, the whole area. In Morwell, approximately how many clients do you have?
Probably about, it's fluid, but at any one time, 45.
And in the larger Latrobe Valley?
Probably well over 100 at any one time.
And what services do you provide for clients in the Latrobe Valley?
In the Latrobe Valley, we don't have a residential facility. All of our clients live in their own homes. So we have two different programs that run from the Morwell office. We have what we call a home care package program, and we have 187 care packages that we provide to clients. Basically, it's a case management program. So we support clients to be able to stay at home for as long. Well, elderly. Sorry, all of our clients are elderly, frail. And we provide supports to them to be able to remain at home. Right. So our other program is a direct care service, so we provide personal care services, home care services to clients through other agencies, as well as to our own service across Gippsland.
So how does a client work with you to work out what care, or what assistance they're provided?
If they're a case managed client, they'll work very closely with the case manager, and together they'll work out a plan of care. It's different for every client. Every client has different needs. essentially a basic package of care, be it high care or low care, because we provide both high and low care services. It's pretty much the equivalent to high care and low care residential services. The funding is the same sort of stream. So it could be a combination of personal care, so they might need assistance with showering, dressing, home care. We usually do the sorts of things that they can no longer do for themselves at home, which supports them to be able to stay at home, shopping, assistance to get to appointments, those sorts of things.
Now, you said that Southern Cross Care has about 1,300 staff in Victoria. In the Gippsland region, how many people are employed with Southern Cross Care?
Over 45.
And that divides roughly into two groups. There are a number of people who work in the office, including, I take it, the case managers.
That's right, yes.
And then there are a number of people who are field staff.
Yes.
So health professionals and carers.
Yeah. The field staff would have a minimum qualification of a Certificate 3 in aged care. Mm-hmm. And the office-based staff, the case managers, would have a tertiary health qualification.
Right. So it's the field staff who actually go to people's homes and provide the one-on-one assistance.
That's correct.
And you tell us in your statement that about 5 of those people are predominantly based here in Morwell.
Yes.
Moving to the events of February this year,
yes.
You live in Traralgon. Were you affected by the fire in the mine at Hazelwood at all?
Personally, yes, in Traralgon. There were times when the smoke was very thick in Traralgon, not as bad as what it was in Morwell. And my home, I had to clean it fairly regular because it was covered. Every surface in my home was covered with a fine coal, ash and dust.
But you're in a position to compare what it was like in your home and what it was like in Morwell because you were working here. What were the conditions like in the office where you were working in Princess Drive? Pretty bad.
At the time, our air conditioning wasn't working particularly well in the office. And particular parts of the office are exposed, like the toilets have louver windows, so that they're not closable at all. So every day the toilets were covered in, depending on the type of day it was, either very thick or a fine dust, coal ash, and the whole office as well became covered in dust. And within the office we could always smell the smell of smoke throughout the whole time. We couldn't get rid of the smell out of the office.
Did you experience any physical symptoms associated with the smoke? What were they?
I'm not asthmatic or have any health problems at all, but throughout the time, I myself, I had a sore throat, headache, I felt tight across the chest, red, sore eyes, the whole time.
Now that the smoke's cleared, have those symptoms endured?
I'm cured.
You tell us at the bottom of that second page of your statement that you were listening to the authorities for advice. What was the message that you got from what you heard?
Difficult to make a decision as to know what to do. The advice that we were getting initially was that everything was okay and that we were safe and there was no harm to communities. There was no action that we needed to take. But I just had to step inside the office or outside the office and know and know myself that wasn't right. Plus we had clients, and like I said, all of our clients are frail and elderly. So we had clients that would be ringing up quite concerned, what's going on, what do we need to do? So it was very difficult to know what to do. We were getting a message from the authorities saying that everything was okay, but we knew ourselves and our clients were also telling us that they knew that it wasn't.
Can we be a little bit more precise about the authorities? Where were you obtaining your information?
Radio, TV, newspapers. I went to one of the community meetings at Kernot Hall myself.
This was the one on the 18th of February?
Yep.
And you also tell us that you were viewing the EPA website regularly.
Yes.
For what reason were you checking that website?
To check out what the levels were, basically, in Morwell South and in Traralgon, just to keep a bit of an eye. It was important. like, as the regional manager, it's my role to make sure not only that our clients are safe, but staff as well. So it was important for us to know just what was happening out there and what the levels were.
And how did you manage the fact that you were sending staff out to work in conditions that you felt to be unsatisfactory?
Yeah, pretty bad actually, because I knew how I felt myself, so it was very difficult to authorise for staff to go out into the community, but we had clients that are vulnerable and at risk, so we needed to know that they were safe. And the best way to do that, apart from phone calls, which we did on a regular basis for those that remained, was to check out the homes and then our staff report back about how they're progressing, how they're faring, basically.
Ms Richards, may I just ask, please?
Ms Wheatland, did
Yes.
you see the community information sheet that was produced by the Department of Health, 3 pages on the 14th of February?
I think so. There was quite a few documents. I think so.
And that gave some sort of suggestions about actions to do. Was that helpful? Or?
We can certainly get the document.
Yeah, I'd have to see it. I probably did, because there was a range of information that was put out in the media and all sorts, so it's difficult to remember exactly what.
I think it was an extra 7.
The evidence is that this is an information sheet that was produced for and available for people who attended the community meeting on the 14th of February, which I think was not the one that you went to.
No. I do recall getting something, I don't know if it was this exact document, but I do recall getting something similar from that meeting. I'm not sure if it was this one.
All right, take your time to have a look at it and see if the advice that's in it is familiar.
Yeah, that looks... That looks similar to what I'm sure that I saw, I think.
Did the information in that assist you to
Not really.
Provide advice to your clients?
It did assist in providing advice, in so much as we could sort of quote from this, that this was the advice, which was pretty much that unless you were susceptible in some way or vulnerable in some way, that you would be okay.
All of your clients are in the vulnerable group, are
yes,
they not?
That's correct. So
Yes.
our advice was to leave the area if they had the ability to do that, and we helped them in any way that we could to do that. That was generally our advice, because they are all vulnerable. And that was before the advice came out that vulnerable people should leave.
All right. And why did you provide that advice to your clients before Dr. Lester formally made that recommendation?
Because they were telling us that they weren't feeling well.
And also, Ms Wheatland, if I may ask, Dr Lester gave evidence about I think the next annexure was a smoke advisory alert that was issued to community organisations. So were you a recipient of those smoke advisory alerts?
I don't recall. I'd have to see one.
And you may have been here when Professor Campbell gave his explanation that it would be helpful if there was some type of a traffic light system for action that you could understand. What does this mean?
Yeah. I could relate to that, because it would be helpful to have just a step-by-step guide, which I assume is what he meant. No, I don't recall seeing those.
It says there on the first page, issued to community groups. So I'm just trying to get a sense of whether or not how wide that community group
I
is.
don't believe that I saw that.
Okay, thank you.
I was asking you about how you managed your health and safety responsibilities to your staff. Did you adopt a system of sending staff who lived in Morwell out of Morwell?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
vice
we did.
versa?
Yeah, staff reported feeling unwell and feeling reluctant to remain and work in the area. So wherever possible, we tried to send them out of the area, and then we had staff that would, say, live in Moe, and we'd bring them into the Morwell area to work, to sort of lessen the exposure or share it around a bit, if you like. That was all that we could do.
And on the 24th of February, you and other members of your staff visited the Community Health Assessment Centre.
First aid opened, yes.
Other evidence suggests that it was open on the 21st of February, although...
It might have been the 21st, I can't recall.
Anyway, you were there on the 24th with other members of your staff?
It might have been the 21st, because I know I was one of the first people that attended, so perhaps it was the 20th, maybe I've got the dates not quite right. But I'm pretty sure that when I attended, I was about the second or third person to attend.
You say that you didn't feel that it was a comprehensive assessment.
No.
Was there a referral given to you?
No.
No? Did you consult your general practitioner about the other symptoms that you were experiencing?
No.
Now, for 2 weeks you'd persisted in working in the office, but on Friday the 21st you decided not to persist. Why was that?
I think that might have been the day that the levels in the afternoon... that was the Friday? Yep. I think that was the day that the levels peaked at about... might have been 1,500 or... I can't remember the exact level, but it was quite high, and we were experiencing, I'd say, distress, staff in the office. So it was about 4 o'clock, I think, in the afternoon, and just sent everybody home. And then on the Monday morning... back at work, I was talking to our head office because we've been in constant touch with them, and a decision was made that we would need to relocate because the smoke was just too unbearable, basically, in the office.
So there are 2 Fridays that you talk about at paragraphs 20 and 21 of your statement. One when you just decided to send the staff home because the air quality levels at Morwell were sky high.
Yes.
But it wasn't until the following Friday that you made the decision to relocate the office, according to your statement.
I think it was the Monday.
The Monday?
Yes.
Well, you tell us in paragraph 21 that the decision was made at around the same time that the Department of Health advised people who were in vulnerable groups to consider relocating.
I can't recall the exact sequence of events. My recollection, without reading what I've written, was that it was on the Friday that we sent staff home, and then I think it was the following Monday that we decided to relocate. Oh, hang on. It was probably the following Monday that we decided to relocate, but it probably took us a week after that to actually find somewhere to relocate to. Yeah.
So in the end, your decision to relocate was independent of the advice of the Chief Health Officer?
I believe so, yes.
It was based on your own assessment of the working conditions?
And consultation with staff and head office. Yep.
Now, you were able to find somewhere to relocate to?
Yeah, it took a week.
And you opened there on the 3rd of March?
Yes.
And although the air was clearer, it was a little constrained.
Yes.
And while you were working from that location at the Old Moe Hospital, you had an unexpected event in your office here in Morwell. What happened?
I was coming back to Morwell. I live in Terrelgan, so I was passing through for 2 reasons and dropping by the office. First reason was to collect the mail, which initially was from the office, and then the mail collection changed to the post office in Morwell. And also just to check the integrity of the office to make sure that everything was okay. And on that particular Monday morning when I came into the office, the kitchen area, there was a pool of water. And when I went up around the corner, there was a whole lot of water. There was clearly had been a flood. And most of the damage was down the walls of our communications room where all of our IT equipment is. And there was a lot of water. The carpet was very soggy. There was a lot of coal dust and ash damage down the wall. The IT equipment was wet, ruined. There was no power in the building at all. The water did about $20,000 worth of damage to our IT and communications equipment. I was lucky that we were relocated at the time, so we were able to continue our business as usual. But it was very distressing and disruptive. It meant a lot of work for not just myself but the whole organisation. We had to have IT come down and replace all the equipment, purchase all equipment, and come down on quite a number of visits to fix it up and replace, basically.
Fortunately, that equipment was insured, and you expect
Yes.
that the cost of replacement will be covered by insurance.
That's correct, and the clean-up.
What caused the flooding?
The plumber who came and checked out the roof said that it was a build-up of coal dust and ash in the downpipes, and it blocked and overflowed.
Now, moving the focus back to your clients, you told the board that you did assist clients to move out of the area
Yes.
before the Chief
Yes.
Health Officer's advice of the 28th of February.
That's correct.
Once she had made that call, provided advice to people who were in vulnerable groups to consider temporary relocation, did you revisit the question of relocating with your
Yes.
clients?
Yeah, absolutely. Many of our clients had already chosen to move anyway, voluntarily, so we assisted them as best we could. Some just took it upon themselves and left anyway, didn't need any help from us. They had family that could help them. Once we got that advice, found it quite unsettling because we'd already been moving clients anyway, but then we also had a few clients that didn't want to move. They decided that they would try and stick it out, and some people just don't want to leave. You know, they like to stay in their own homes, and we just had to try and support them and help them as best we could so that they were safe as possible.
All right. You have a couple of matters that you've raised at the end of your statement under improvements for the future, and I'd like to ask you about a couple of those. The first is paragraph 36. You make the point that there should have been earlier monitoring and earlier advice about what to do. What would you have liked to have seen?
To me, it was pretty obvious when I walked outside or just breathed the air in the office that things were not right, because of the way I felt personally. So I knew that if I'm healthy, how would it feel for, like our vulnerable clients who aren't quite as healthy as what I am, and yet I felt unwell. So I sort of thought there probably should have been earlier warnings or advice for vulnerable people to move because of the levels, I believe. But mainly based on my own personal experience that I felt unwell, so I think that if elderly, vulnerable people would have felt a lot worse than what I did.
And then you comment on the change in the advice after nearly 3 weeks. What effect did the change in the advice that people now should consider relocation have?
It was quite unsettling by that stage because we'd already gone through so much and already... it was very difficult for us to make a decision based on the advice that we were given or to know what to do. We're largely government funded, so we're pretty much obliged to take the advice of the government authorities. And I found it really difficult to make a decision to know what to do because the advice was pretty much that everything's okay, but I knew it wasn't. Like I said, within myself, I knew that it wasn't okay.
Thank you, Ms Wheatland. I've no further questions. Do members of the board have any further questions?
Just to clarify the last paragraph there, paragraph 37, would you like to, on that page, would you like to elaborate, residents were not being treated well. What would you regard as a suggestion for improvement? You felt that the residents were being treated well. What would you have preferred to see or experience?
Clear guidance and advice, and I think like the previous doctor had said, he described it as the red light or the traffic light. clearer advice and guidance, and perhaps earlier. I think the advice that we got was late. I don't think that it was considered in the context of the vulnerable people that are living in the community. Should have been earlier.
Okay, thank you.
No questions, thank you.
As there are no further questions, may Ms Wheatland be excused? Thank you.
Thank you.
That concludes the evidence for today. Tomorrow we're moving into a separate area of discourse, question of communications. In the morning, we have two experts in the area of communications who've been retained by the inquiry. Professor Jim McNamara, a professor in public communications from the University of Technology, Sydney, and Lachlan Drummond from a communications consultancy, Red Handed, that specialises in regional Victoria. And it's proposed that they give their evidence concurrently in the same way that Dr Torre and Ms Richardson did yesterday morning. After their evidence, we'll hear from Marita Tabane, who is the chair of MJPIC, the Emergency Management Joint Public Information Committee, to which Commissioner Lapsley referred during his evidence. We have a community witness, Brooke Burke, who I'll seek to interpose after lunch. He's a very young child, some weeks, who was born during the fire. And the last witness for tomorrow will be John Mitchell, who's the Acting Chief Executive Officer of the Latrobe City Council.
All stand.